Hi, Jocelyn. It's lovely to have you with us again today on Salford City Radio for our CEDAW special for 50s women. And I'd like to ask you to start off with mediation is suggested as a way to break the deadlock between the government and the 1950s women on the question of compensation. What is mediation and how does it work?
Right, good morning, Ian. Really good to be together with you too. And on the mediation issue, mediation is a process that can be run in at least two ways. First of all, you bring the parties together with a mediator, and there are law firms or chambers that specialise in mediation. There are also individual lawyers who specialise in mediation, and sometimes it could be a judge who's a retired judge who becomes a mediation specialist. And how it works is that the parties come together with a mediator, and each side, of course, would have its ambit claim. Take, for example, one lot might be saying, I'm just using a theoretical example, if it's the government and individual parties who say we've got a dispute, the government might say, well, our option is that XX is what we should pay out. And the other side says, well, we want YY. So they have to negotiate an agreed position, and the government wouldn't get XX and the other lot wouldn't get YY, but they come together with an equal sort of agreement, and they can be all in the same room. The other way that you can do it is separate, that you have one party, say the government, in one room, and the other party, the party with the dispute, in the other room, and the mediators work between both groups, consult with the government in the one room, what's the government saying, and then they go into the other room and they consult with the other party and they say, well, look, the government's saying this, and what are you saying? And then they get this party's agreement, well, we don't agree with what the government's saying, but this is what we put back. And so that then the mediators go back into the room with the government. So it can be done with all the parties in the one room, or it can be done with the parties in separate rooms. But the whole point of it is that you get a trained mediator who knows how to work this sort of a process, and they don't intercede in terms of what the terms of the agreement would be, but they help the parties to come to an agreement between each other where there's been a dispute. That's the first point I'd like to make. And the second one is that there doesn't have to be legal action instituted with all the costs that involves in order to have a mediation between government and a party that has a dispute with it. That's clear, and it simply makes sense because, first of all, the courts are extremely overloaded and they don't want more cases than they have already or that they 100% need to deal with. And when there is an opportunity for negotiation and mediation, well, then that's the route that one would think is a sensible route to take.
Thank you, Jocelyn. You probably preempted my second question there, which is it necessary to launch a legal action in the courts before parties can engage in mediation?
That's right. It isn't necessary to have a legal action on foot. And as I've said, mediation, it can be expensive because the mediators have to be paid. But the point is that that's not the same as the expense that's involved in court process. And also, it means that it's a mediation team that's being employed rather than action in the courts, which are overloaded.
And what benefit would there be for 1950s women to negotiate with government through mediation? And also, what's the benefit for the government to negotiate with 50s women for mediation?
Well, Ian, first of all, it's clear that there is a dispute, and anybody saying there's no dispute here has not been paying attention, frankly. So there's a dispute. And is it going to go on and on and on and on as it's gone on and on and on with no resolution? Or is the sensible and wise thing for the government to say, look, let's get together and actually try to resolve this? Therefore, there's a benefit to government because it won't be this superating saw that's going on and which is tying them up in having to respond to media inquiries and having to respond in Parliament and having debates going on, Westminster Hall, etc., and questions asked in Parliament. So there's a benefit for government. The benefit for the 1950s born women is for them too, the matter needs to be resolved, and women are dying, and therefore they're dying without this resolution. It really seems sensible. And the other aspect of this is that it's clear that there are a number of groups that are involved in this. The WASPI group is referred to constantly. Well, you can't actually refer to WASPI as a group because there is a company for which people pay money to join that company. There's a fee. But there are other groups that call themselves WASPI. There's one in Wales. There's WASPI group up in Manchester. There's WASPI group in Scotland. And I don't think they're all represented by WASPI fee. And then there's the CEDAW in law group. And it seems that there are different opinions amongst all these different groups. So the first mediation that really needs to happen is to bring all the groups together so that they can come to an agreed position on what they will go to negotiate with the government on. Because in a way, the government is in a difficult position because it's confronted with a whole lot of groups that aren't really ad idem. And the other point about this, the groups not being ad idem, they're actually letting the government get away with it. Because if you can't come to a mediated agreement amongst the groups themselves, then of course the government can say, well, we're not going to pay any attention. Because why would the government pay attention when there's numerous groups outside putting varying positions? It simply doesn't make sense. So it is sensible for all the women's groups to get together with a negotiator, with a mediator, come to a conclusion as about what they're going to put to the government. And its benefit to the government to have that resolution to come to mediation, because then they're not having to deal with this as an ongoing matter. And the Department of Works and Pensions, the Secretary for Works and Pensions, can get on with other work in that department, which certainly needs work done to parallel.
Thank you, Jocelynne. Yes, and as you say there, if they're divided, it's like divide and conquer, isn't it? So the government has said that 90% of 50s women were notified in 2007 of the change to the state pension age. From where has the government derived that figure? Is the focus on delay in notification the only route for 50s women to take?
Well, I have to say it's a complete mystery as to where this notification of 90% of women has come in 2007. But in response to that, I'd make several points. Number one, well, what about the other 10% then? Do we just dump them and they're absolutely irrelevant? I mean, 10% of women, I wouldn't be saying you shouldn't pay attention to them. But secondly, as to 2007, you see, if it were true that 90% of the women were notified in 2007, then what about the changes that came about in 2011 and 2014? Because if you were notified in 2007 and then your position was changed by the 2011 or the 2014 Act, the notification in 2007 would be a false notification. It wouldn't be an accurate notification. That's number one. Number two, the 2011 Act was the first act in Section 1 of the 2011 Act. It actually refers to this is about changing the state pension age. So that was the first notification that was clear in any act. That's 2011. And then what we find is that in Stephen Webb, who was the pensions minister in 2011, he acknowledges this. The 2011 Act, for which I was responsible, did not add any more than 18 months. It was typically 12 months to the age. But when we did write to people and we did write to tell them what changes we have made, this was the first time they had heard about the first changes. That's Pensions Minister Stephen Webb MP acknowledging that it was only in the 2011 Act that was acknowledged to anyone. Now, that notification that he refers to, that actually in itself does not confirm that the women or all the women or how many women or how they were notified, what was the method of telling them that it was done. He said that there was notification in 2011, but as I say, it's unclear. And then in the judicial review that was run by the Glynn Judicial Review of 2019, Michael Mansfield, who represented the women at that time, went through a series of confirmations that there was no notification. And then if you go to the House of Commons Work and Pensions Committee reporting in March 2016, it says, what is apparent with hindsight is that previous governments could have done a lot better in communicating the changes. Well into this decade, too many affected women were unaware of the equalisation of the state pension age at 65, legislated for in 1995. Now, if they're unaware of that change, they're not aware of the subsequent ones. And then while the last and current governments have done more to communicate, this has been too little too late for many women, especially given increases in the state pension age have accelerated at relative notice. And then many women justifiably feel aggrieved. So that's the Work and Pensions Committee from the Parliament in March 2016. And one therefore really should be saying to the government, from whence does this contention that 90% of women were notified in 2007 come? And really, there should be an explicit statement from the government as to where they have come up with this magic contention of 90% of women notified. And it really seems to me that trying to hide behind a contention that 90% of women were notified in 2007 without saying explicitly how they were allegedly notified, where the notification came from, where they're getting this 90% figure from, that really needs to be addressed. And what were they notified of in 2007? The other point is that in that Glynn judicial review, an officer of the Department of Work and Pensions actually said that it was in 2007 that they began to think that they ought to notify. So that was just a beginning to think about it. And there was an acknowledgement that it was seen as too hard. And there's actually a statement in that judicial review that it was impossible to notify the women, whereas Her Majesty's Revenue Office has an address for every single taxpayer, that is for every single individual in the country who's paying into the National Insurance Scheme. So it's risible, this contention that it was all too hard to notify. And as I say, I'm bemused. One must be bemused at where this 90% figures come from.
Thank you, Jocelynne. The government says there's no money for 1950s women, and the argument seems to be that they do not deserve it anyway. Is that a fair enough assessment?
Well, there's been an overlooking of the 1950s women right from the outset, because back in 1995, when the changes were brought about, again in that judicial review, it said that the stakeholders were notified. Well, the 1950s women were not notified. And so what that indicates is that back in 1995, these women did not count. They were not on the radar. They were not seen as a major stakeholder, and indeed the stakeholder. So they didn't count. And that's really saying that the women were irrelevant to government. And the idea that their economic position was impacted, it appeared that 1950s women weren't seen as economic stakeholders. Secondly, as to me, we all understand that the government is in difficulty in terms of revenue. That's clear. But the revenue that is there came from 1950s women, and they have not had their payments into the National Health Insurance Scheme paid out to them. So their money has been used to support government activities when they really should have gained their entitlement.
And the last question, Jocelyn, we've got is, you were in New York for the 69th Commission on the Status of Women, which reviewed the Beijing Platform and Declaration of 1995, which is 30 years ago. What issues do you see as relevant to 50s women arising out of the discussion there?
The Platform and Declaration of 1995 had first point women and poverty. And the problem for 1950s women is that many of them have been left in poverty because they were paying into the national insurance scheme on the understanding that they would gain their pension at 60. And that has not come to pass. And therefore, they have been deprived of the money to which they were entitled. And this change to the state pension age from 60 to 65 for women, it could have been done in a way that did not target 1950s women, that did not put them in poverty, that did not mean that 100% of them didn't get money that they put in, which is the principle of the National Health Scheme. And secondly, these women are in poverty. And ironically, the Beijing Platform and Declaration was made in 1995. And that's the date that the initial act, the State Pension Act, making this change came into being. And unfortunately, since that day, governments have been unmindful and lacking insight into the realities of 1950s women, that they are human beings who are entitled to economic status of which they have been deprived because of changes in the 1995, 2007, 2011 and 2014 Act. I don't think anybody now is saying we want all our money back. But what they're saying, in my understanding, if they've got this sense, is that we do want a fair recompense for the damage that's been done to us, for the failure to let us know that these changes were happening, for the direct discrimination on grounds of age and grounds of sex that arose out of this change, and that the government must come to the table and engage in mediation, which is the sensible way out of this impasse.
That's wonderful, Jocelyn. Thank you very much. And it's been lovely to chat with you again today. Now, you've picked a record which takes me back to 1978 when I was going to college. And it's a great record, isn't it?
Yeah, this is Heights by Kate Bush, and it's just fantastic. There are many different iterations of it with Kate Bush singing it on YouTube. And I think the best one is where she's dancing about in a red dress singing this song. And of course, many women have taken up this song, and there's a national day of the Wuthering Heights when all the women get together and dance in different cities, Manchester, Poole and so on, wearing red garments and singing the Kate Bush song, Wuthering Heights. It's really a fantastic song, and it's just really wonderful because there's so much joy in it as well as so much wailing. And I think, therefore, that what we know about the 1950s women is that there is wailing. They're quite entitled to wail. They are quite entitled to be upset. They're quite entitled to be discombobulated and more because of the impact on them of the state pension age. At the same time, there are a wonderful group of women with loads of energy, with loads of enthusiasm, and with the will to keep on. And if the government's got any sense, it will recognise that you cannot write off 1950s women, that the 1950s women are the women who were active in the 1970s, saying we will not be put upon, demand our rights, and the 1950s women are entitled to their rights. So now over to Kate Bush and Wuthering Heights. Ian.